First topic of discussion now, as Nigeria's capacity to weather the storm remains eroded by deep-seated institutional vulnerabilities and social challenges. Moody's Investor Services have downgraded Nigeria's rating to a lower level as CAA1, sinking the country's economy into deeper non-investment grade from the country's previous worrisome ratings of B3. The Global Credit Ratings Agency, in its economic outlook, projects that government's fiscal and debt position will worsen as the countries grapple with far-reaching fiscal strain. Recall that October last year, the ratings agency downgraded Nigeria's local currency and foreign currency long-term issuer ratings, as well as its foreign currency senior unsecured debt ratings to B3 from B2 and placed them on review for downgrade. It will also interest you to know that the ratings downgrade is a message to foreign investors that the country's current bonds, debt, and its potential to take on more debt are at risk, making it more expensive to borrow. Well, let's make sense of all of this. And joining me via Zoom to analyze the impact of this latest downgrade of overall economic outlook for Nigeria's economy. He is the Director of Research and Strategy. Is with Chapel Hill, Denham, Mr. Tajuddin Ibrahim. Good afternoon, Mr. Ibrahim. It's great to start the week with you on Business Nigeria.
Good afternoon. Thank you for having me on the show.
Yes, like I said in my introduction, we had a downgrade, one of it in October last year, and now this is coming, downgrading Nigeria's currency and debt ratings to CAA1. Please make us understand what all of this means back to back. We had one in October, and we're having this again from Moody's. What does it mean for us?
I think the rating downgrade, broadly speaking, is negative. And that is the key message and the key takeaway in the action by Moody's. One thing that Nigerians have to bear in mind is that the rating agency want the country in terms of forward-looking rating downgrade in October of last year. And naturally, the expectation would have been that the government would have done something to address the major part of the issues raised by the rating agency. And, as we speak now that, there was nothing done, rather, the numbers were, largely speaking, getting worse. So those are some of the factors that triggered, the downgrade. And in terms of the ratings assigned by Moody's, there are three broad categories. Those in category A are considered as high quality borrowers in terms of, debt obligations. And those in category B are considered, as, medium, to high, quality in terms of, their borrowings, capacity and their obligations as well. That is where Nigeria was before, the middle range, which is B. But now that, we have moved to the lowest range, which is, band C, that is, a range where Nigeria is now considered a very high, credit risk country, which means that, there are high chances of default, by the country. So those are the meanings of the downgrade. And generally speaking, it is negative for us as a country, in my view.
Of course, this would affect investors' confidence who want to bring their money into the country. And even before now, we had issues with foreign direct investment on one side, foreign portfolio investment on one side, having some to know which is which. But how well will this impact anybody that want to bring his money into this country?
Okay, so the major way it affects us as a country is around the ability of Nigeria to borrow externally. If we take a look, for instance, at the budget for 2023, which is around 21.8 trillion, we notice that the deficit is huge at around 10.8 trillion, and the government is looking at borrowing locally by borrowing about up to 7 trillion naira locally, and there are expectations of borrowing externally. We understand that the federal government has indicated that Nigeria will not be looking to issue any Eurobond this year. Nevertheless, it is negative, for the country in terms of our ability to borrow externally. No lender globally would be willing, to lend you money when they realize, that your borrowing capacity in terms of the ability of you to meet your obligations, when they realize that, the ratio has come down significantly. So they'll be less willing. So we are not going to see foreign investors, take renewed interest in the debt instrument issued by Nigeria. Either, we're talking about, new borrowings, or we are talking about existing borrowings, or debt instruments that we have at the international capital market. So these are the areas in which it is negative. Foreign portfolio investment, as we speak, is very low, and this current development will make it further lower, in my view.
Interesting stuff. But government fiscal debt position continues to deteriorate. That is something that we've talked about very recently. I think sometime last week, the FRS came up with about 10.1 trillion naira generated revenue. That's the first time we'll get that high. But do you see any way out for government, maybe not to borrow externally? Can we domesticate borrowing one way or the other?
So yes, we can domesticate borrowing, but it will have a lot of other implications. And the major of such an implication is that we are going to see interest rates going materially high. And it will imply that the government will be crowding out the private sector. By the time the government gets to the markets to borrow more than 7 trillion naira, you would then question yourself that what is left for the average Nigerians to borrow, what is left for small and medium enterprises to borrow to drive their own businesses. So when they want to borrow, when they get to the banks, what most likely will happen is that liquidity in the banking sector will have somewhat dried up. And when small businesses and also individuals want to borrow at that point in time, they will be borrowing at significantly high interest rates. This is, largely speaking, killing the economy from a micro standpoint. This is also killing the economy from a small business perspective. So it is negative. Even though we can domesticate borrowing, it will mean that we will be driving interest rates higher, and that could crowd out the private sector and small businesses as a whole.
You touched on the budget too, which has a larger deficit than what we even had in 2022. And that is what experts have continued to speak around. What I'm wondering, the non-oil sector has been performing a bit well than what we used to see before now. Do you think we can take advantage? Now, we've not heard any much regarding the Finance Act. I think there's a little bit of touch on that document. But do you think all of this can help government at least reduce some of this burden one way or the other? You think it's the big elephant in the cupboard, removal of subsidy, that can at least help government heave a sigh of relief?
I think if we want to be truthful to ourselves as a country, the low-hanging fruits for consideration in this case, I believe, is the removal of subsidy. We estimate that if we remove subsidy for full 2023, Nigeria, we estimate at Chapel Hill Denham that we'll be able to save about 6 trillion naira in terms of the budget deficit. And what that implies is that instead of Nigeria going to borrow 10.8 trillion naira to finance the deficit, we can, we may have to borrow just about, 4 to 5 trillion naira. And that is because we would have removed subsidy. So that is what I believe, the government should focus on. And if there are concerns around removal of subsidy, I think every Nigerian by now, would have seen that, they are buying petrol at 500, 400, 300, because it is just not available in the desired volume. So what it means is that technically speaking, we are buying petrol at high prices above the number 185 naira. So removing the subsidy right now, wouldn't really hurt us. It will have a long-term benefit for the country as a whole, in my view.
Interesting stuff. But let's talk about inflation. Yes, these are some burning issues. And we see that the central bank has continued with this hawkish move. As at the moment, 17.5% is the MPR. Side by side, all other parameters left unchanged. But many will tell you that the deceleration we saw in December might not necessarily be as a result of all of the efforts being put in by the Apex Bank. What is your reaction to this, and what does it mean for our outlook as we move on in the year?
I think I agree with those that say that the deceleration that we saw in inflation was not necessarily because of the action of the CBN. I subscribe to their view, and my sense is that we are even yet to see the peak of inflation. If we bear in mind the impact of the current petrol scarcity, we will notice that inflation is still going to go higher. By the time we see January number, my sense is that the number will be much higher than 21.34 percent. And I think if we look at the spillover effect of the scarcity of petroleum, it will have an impact on transport fare. It is having impact on dispatch and logistic businesses. It is having impact on a whole lot of things because everybody wants to capture the increases in their cost of doing business and pass it on to consumers. So we are still going to see higher inflation. And I think the earlier we removed subsidy, the better for the country, because everybody will just adjust their pockets, and whatever uptick we see in inflation from that point in time will be minimal over, like a 1 year period, in my view.
Well, let's look at countries that can't meet up with borrowing or can't pay back, where they are already defaulting. What happens to countries like that, when they default? What's the implication on such an economy?
So I'm just hoping that we do not default as a country. I easily remember that Ghana defaulted on their Eurobond. They were initially downgraded by Moody's, and after that a default materialized for Ghana as a country. So they are currently speaking with the IMF to get up to like a $3 billion bailout. So the concern in this case for global investors is that they'll be watching out for Nigeria to see how if we have a new administration by after the election coming up next month, they'll be watching out to see how they will address some of the key concerns of Moody's, for instance. And one of such concern is debt sustainability, and also the ability to generate revenue that can comfortably pay for our debt over the period that we have those debts maturing. So if we as a country should default, then it means our ability to generate to attract foreign investors will be almost zero. And this is where the government has to do something. Maybe not the current administration because they're already going out, but the new administration that comes in has a lot to do in terms of addressing our debt sustainability. The second thing to my mind, I think, is we have countries such as Greece, such as Argentina, in the global economy that have also in the past defaulted on their debt obligations. So Nigeria should learn from all those developments and put things in the right to ensure that we do not default. Otherwise, we are going to see a lot of negative impact from a global investor standpoint.
Mr. Brian, before I let you go, a report is out that the United Nations is saying Nigeria's economy will grow at 3%. The AFDB also came up with a good report saying Africa's economies will surpass expectation this year, despite all of these challenges. What is your growth projection for Africa's most populous nation? If you don't mind, maybe the continent?
So I think, those numbers are unlikely to materialize in 2023. Talking about, 3% for Nigeria is unlikely to materialize this year. Number one, we have, extremely high inflation, and that implies that, it will impact how we measure the GDP because the deflator will be materially high. And the second thing to my mind is that we're in an election year, and in an election year, you would see some level of distraction in terms of the election processes, and to some extent, that will affect our productivity as a country. And if I capture also the distraction that we are seeing in terms of people going to queue for PVC, and also people queuing at filling stations, and also people queuing at the banks, to get the new notes, all those elements are negative to the productivity of the country as a whole. So I reckon that 2.5% or even 2% looks more like the number in terms of growth outlook for the country in 2023. And before we begin to see 3% and above, it is probably in 2024, in my view.
I must thank you so much for your time. Mr. Tajuddin Ibrahim is the Director of Research and Strategy, Chapel Hill, Denham. Do enjoy your day at work.
Thank you.